Good morning and welcome to the Irish NFL show. Sunday morning. It's been quite a while since we've done one of these shows on a Sunday morning, Colin. But we've got three interesting games to get through after Saturday night. As always, the Irish NFL show is brought to you by Cassidy Travel, who are already planning for the 2023 season with a pre-order option available in terms of giving your team interest, giving your logistical interest in terms of where you want to go, what game you potentially would like to look at next season. Check that out. It'll be on the bio. We will be putting that out, of course, Twitter later on today and on the podcast bios as well. Colin, good morning. Wet and windy in Dublin. Wet and windy throughout the course of the country. And there was some wild weather in Buffalo last night, but we'll probably get to that game later on. There was a bigger one, which didn't look like it was going to be the case, but you're very welcome this morning. How are you?
Good, Brian. As we said on the preview show, when it comes this time of the year and Saturday football and all the talk about the weather, we saw the snowballs that I'm sure we will get to. But we got a couple of really great games last night and a divisional ding dong matchup in terms of the Browns and the Ravens. So yeah, plenty to discuss. And the best thing is, here we are discussing this last night games, and we still have tonight's games to look forward to.
Yeah, it's funny when I was looking at the order to which we would discuss here this morning. It would have been the Buffalo game starting off, but obviously what we saw in the 6 o'clock game was quite unusual. In terms of a game which looked like it was completely out off the park. The game was over essentially. The Colts had this one. They were 33-0 up at halftime. The Vikings couldn't get get out of their way in the first half, and I mean the opening drives in the game from
Right, I think, I think Brian, maybe there's that so much going on that it was the game. It felt like that. What's going on, I think, for you now is probably what was going on in Kirk Cousins' mind in that first half, because absolutely nothing went his way in that first half. The Vikings, the special teams were a disaster. They couldn't stop the kick return. They had blocked punt. They had the overturn. Justin Jefferson went down injured, and yeah, they went in at halftime, 33 points down. Brett Coleman had tweeted that the 40-3 defeat was the worst Vikings defeat in 6 decades, and he thought that they could be looking at an even worse victory. What were your thoughts at halftime at that point?
Well, it was a combination of two things. I felt the Colts played very well, but the Vikings couldn't get out of their way in the first half. You touched on it there. I mean, the opening drive, they allow a big return on the kickoff, which essentially puts the Colts in a good position, good field position. They end money with a field goal. The following drive, they blocked the punt. The following drive, after a massive run by Cook, which I always find very unusual that they go back to the running back immediately after he's had a 50 to 60 yard kind of run. And we saw it last year in the Patriots Cowboys game where Harris went off in a big run, handed it to him immediately when he looked gas and he fumbled. And essentially that's exactly what we saw. Cook fumbles, Colts recover. They quickly have a quick fire drive essentially and go up 17. And then I suppose the icing on the cake for the Colts was just before half time. The pick six right deep in their own territory for the Vikings, and 33-0. You know, you're looking at all the memes on Twitter, all the social stuff is around the fact that it's a game on a Saturday, and if only the Colts could play every Saturday, you know. And then I looked up to see where they're playing on Saturday and Christmas Eve, but no, they're Monday Night Football against the Chargers. And look, even in the middle of this in third quarter, it still didn't feel like there was anything more than a couple of consolation scores in the offing for the Vikings. Osborne goes in, and you know, had a couple of Packers and Bears fans obviously even an interest for the division, not necessarily because they're going to go anywhere, but more because it's the Vikings, and they're saying, but at least the score would look respectable and it would allow Kirk Cousins a different narrative after the game. He can put it down to silly mistakes, and Kevin O'Connell could just say it's one that got away. We'll move on to the Giants game on Christmas Eve, and then all of a sudden, I don't know what it is with Matty Ryan, and he just, and the offensive line didn't know favours. I mean, the defense for the Vikings essentially took over, and he was getting sacked at will. And there was again some questionable calls at times by the Colts, and you know, later in the game, should they have taken the field goal? Probably getting away from the fantastic comeback by the Vikings, but you know, there was a decision there to go for a field goal, and most head coaches in that position may have taken it. But I guess for the Colts, with nothing to play for, they just felt that was an opportunity to put the game away. The Vikings in the first half had 24 yards of offense. Like, that is surreal. And yeah, you look at Kirk Cousins' numbers this morning, and he finishes with 460 yards, 4 touchdowns, and he got everybody in on the action. Thielen, Osborne, Jefferson, the receiving touchdown from Cook. I mean, it was mind blowing. And as the game continuously went on, and they were creeping back into it, you just sensed the momentum was building. And even in overtime, I mean, the Colts still had an opportunity to go and win the game. Couldn't put it away. And it's interesting. I've seen a number of these delayed game calls recently in the NFL. You know, where teams are trying to get into field goal range and they're trying to do one final snap to spike the ball, and teams are delaying games. And some referees are calling it, and some aren't, and some are very keen to call it. And look, it was a penalty, but again, the difference in interpretation with some referees against others, as we've seen over the past few weeks, is interesting. But for the Vikings, it's been a fantastic season. I mean, they've won the division, set all sort of records. Kevin O'Connell's first year, you put up a great tweet last night around the nature of the season which you had. We were obviously fortunate to interview him last summer, and he seemed like a really great guy, and you can understand why those players are so keen to deliver for him and keep hold of that second seed placing, because if they had a loss last night, it would have been back in the 49ers hands. The 49ers would have leapfrogged them into the second seed, so that was a significant win, and there's still bigger games to come. And the 49ers would have been looking at that last night thinking we're having a great weekend, having rested up after Thursday, only to see a great Vikings come back. It was, for unusual, it was one of the better games we've seen this season.
I got stuck there trying to get myself off mute. Yeah, I think, to me, I suppose, some of what you said, Brian, I'd nearly go back. And you talked a bit about Kevin O'Connell. Like, this Spurs team, and we had Arif Hassan on, and other people were saying it. After the draft, it was like, it's the same old Vikings. It was like Spurs, right? They weren't expected to do anything. They were expected to be nice. They were expected to, have a couple of nice plays. They've got Justin Jefferson. He'll probably have some nice games. But ultimately, this wasn't a team that was expected to go anywhere. Everyone kind of laughed when they paid Kirk Cousins the money that they did. And yeah, people will look at it and will say, 10 one-score victories, they'll regress next year. And maybe they will, but ultimately, this is the first-year head coach who, the narrative up to, I think, the past couple of years has been, you couldn't have expectations. But we've now seen Stefanski with the Browns, Sirianni with the Eagles, and now O'Connell with the Vikings show what he can do. And the players clearly respond to him. They clearly respect him, and he's going out there, and they're demonstrating. I thought, weirdly, the defense were okay yesterday. It was special teams and the offense that put them in such a hole. He talked about it, gifted them 14 points, but as the game went on, and even Jamar Chase tweeted about Justin Jefferson's touchdown and the route and what he did to Gilmore, who had him, absolutely tied up in that first half, and we saw him go into the blue tent. I think Jefferson went into the blue tent twice, actually, and Christian Darrisaw went down. But it tells you, I suppose, the spirit and camaraderie of that team, that they were out there until the end. So I am, what this means long term for the Vikes and where it'll end up, we've no idea. Could the Vikings go into the playoffs and lose immediately? Absolutely. But I think they're likely to play your Giants, the Commanders, or the Seahawks. I think both teams will look at that and say, the Vikings and whoever they're playing will say, there's a chance here. So the Vikings, could win a playoff game. It'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. But I think, for where expectations were for Kevin O'Connell and the franchise writ large, they have, no matter what happens for the rest of the season, they have over-delivered on what was expected.
Yeah, it's a very valid point around who they could come up against in the playoffs and how they'd all feel they have an opportunity to go into Minnesota and put themselves in a position to win the game. You reflect on what Michael Lombardi said when we had him on live last week. He was discussing the games in which they've won at home this season, and every single team getting on that airplane after the game saying, how did we not win this game? There was several games in which teams had it there to win, and they didn't get over the line. The Lions were leading with a minute to go. We saw recently with the Jets having the opportunity to win the game, and the Colts last night is probably the biggest one of all, which is, when you have a record setting loss in terms of the greatest comeback in NFL history. It'd be hard to take, and the Colts owner has already come out. I think he came out prior to the game saying a very open canvas in terms of who we're going to look for the next head coach. So that's interesting. That essentially he's already making that decision that it won't be Jeff Saturday taking on the job. One thing that will get lost in the game, and maybe it won't, maybe it'll be Monday or Tuesday when it gets really discussed, was the refereeing in the game, Colin, because the Vikings have won the game now, so it kind of puts to bed some of the poor decisions in which we saw. I mean, in the first half we saw a third down where he ripped the ball out of Pittman's arms, and it was called as an incomplete pass, but he held onto that ball for quite a significant amount of time. The play wasn't dead from what we see in the NFL, and of course they scoop up, and essentially it should have been a pick, a recovery and return for a touchdown. And then I think the one in the fourth quarter in particular, when at that stage like the Vikings were down by 8, needed to get the ball back to get that touchdown, and obviously be in a position to go for 2 points, another scoop and score essentially, which we see every week in the NFL, and that one was definitely a touchdown. But more so, what was disappointing, and we've seen it creep back into the game recently. Early on in the season, we weren't seeing it. It was that very much, as you said, just let them play, and for it to be whistled down. I mean, you allow the player to run it in. I mean, even if it's pulled back and challenged or whatsoever, or reviewed by upstairs, and it becomes a non-factor because it's not a fun because his knee is down or he's got the ball down. But for it to be so blatantly obvious. I mean, we didn't even have time off from them going upstairs to look at it. It was literally a ding-dong downstairs. You've got it wrong. It's a fumble. Give the Vikings the ball. And unfortunately, they've come out the right side of the result. But if they hadn't, it would have been very interesting to see how frustrated and how animated Kevin O'Connell would have gotten the press conference over, because it would have been essentially the decision that may have cost them the game. Your thoughts on this, on those two, or just in general the whole refereeing of the game?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I definitely agree in terms of blowing up too early on those. I would say Kevin O'Connell's thoughts on those. Obviously, the result have been different, but also maybe on his player showing the frustration that he did in terms of the 15-yard penalty. And I get the frustration, but my goodness, sometimes you have to ensure that you channel that in the right way, and that you don't take your helmet off on the field. I think what's interesting to me, Brian, is they blow. It's the inconsistency, right? Because at other times we have seen almost this year, maybe more than any other years, the rolling mauls that you see in rugby become more of a factor in the NFL. And I know that Sam Monson has been on a crusade to get Americans to realize that they're mauls and not scrums. And he actually managed to get one of the broadcast teams to change their verbiage on that. So kudos to Sam. But that's one of the points, is at what point does forward progress stop? And if you're going to allow the offense when they are moving as such, and if you're going to allow, the second and third attempts, then why all of a sudden when the defense get a strip or a sack or whatever it happens to be, why are you penalizing them? Look, I think it's the inconsistency, and I get it. This is humans. This is two people can look at the exact same thing and see it differently. I think, fortunately, in this instance, the game didn't come down to refereeing. Ultimately, the Colts just imploded in the second half, and the Vikings were deserved victors.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough off season for the Colts to see where to go. It looks like they will also need a new quarterback as well as a new head coach. So there's a big rebuild there. It's funny, I had a couple of Colts fans text me at half time saying, we're not out of winning this division. If we were to win this game, we'd be 5-8-1. And if results, it's amazing how every NFL fan has a permutation in their head of how they can still make the playoffs. But that's essentially is put it to bed. I thought it was put to bed a couple of weeks ago, but they'll be licking their chops this week, and looking forward to a difficult game next week against the Chargers. It's going to be a rough week for the Colts and for the Vikings as they play the Giants next week on Christmas Eve, and they need to keep on winning to secure this number 2 seed. It's going to be crucial come the playoffs. We'll move on to the Saturday night late game, 1:15 a.m. for us, which I watched in full this morning. I won't lie, I didn't stay up till 4 in the morning, but I did make an early start this morning to get the game in. Fantastic game. I didn't think it would be that type of game. We saw like a similar type of weather conditions last week. Maybe they were a little bit worse last week in terms of how the Bills Jets played each other with a 2012 game. I thought that was the type of game we'd see last night, but it wasn't to be. The weather had really no impact on the game. The Tua was 70 and 30, 234 yards, 2 touchdowns. Josh Allen had a fantastic night, 25 and 40, over 300 yards, and four touchdowns. I mean, it was a great game, bearing in mind the conditions. The conditions really kind of got worse as the game went on in terms of in the fourth quarter, in particular on the last drive in which the Bills managed to get over the line with a 32-29 win. This one for me is one that the Dolphins, I didn't think the Dolphins could win this game. I thought this would be too much. You called it out on Thursday, the consistency with the schedule, how the inconsistency in a way that a team is asked to go on the road 3 weeks in a row and turn around from the Sunday night on the game on the West Coast to play Saturday night. I thought the conditions and the upheaval of a week would be too much for him. But in fairness, Mike McDaniel had the team ready to play. I thought they were really good defensively, as well as you can do against Josh Allen when he's in form. And just feels like one of those they got away. I was looking at the numbers this morning. Waddle 114 yards touchdown, Hill at 69 in the touchdown. Mostert went for 136 yards rushing. You look at all the stats after a game, you say, geez, that's a fantastic offensive performance. And yeah, they still come out on the wrong side of a defeat. And look, I think the Dolphins will be okay. They've got winnable games to get in the playoffs. Huge win for the Bills to remain that number one seeding. With tougher games to come, they still have to play the Bengals away, which will be a really tricky game. But I don't know. I just had a few Dolphins fans as well text me saying it really is one that they felt that it was there for the winning, and it just didn't transpire that way.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the Dolphins will probably feel that, as you said, Brian, that it was there. There were some moments where, on a different night, that Tua might have made a couple of different decisions, and it could have all gone very, very, very differently. For the Bills and Bills Mafia, they definitely march on. And for the Dolphins, this could they're winnable games certainly, but those two divisional matchups to end the season, on the road to the Patriots and then at home to the Jets, those will obviously be the key, probably the deciding factors for them. So when it comes down to those divisional matchups, that is one to really, really keep an eye on. And I think, though, given what I had said, this was the third game on the road. They're so impressive in terms of what they do offensively, and you saw it. That, I mean, ultimately, if the Bills hadn't horse collared, they would have been a touchdown, and that was just incredible. That run, it was just an outside zone run, and he just ran and ran and ran, and the speed that they come at you. And I suppose the Patriots will probably be hoping that it'll be a similar type of night weather-wise or day weather-wise when they welcome the Dolphins. But that game in Miami against the Jets, that is one to circle, because that might be a Week 18 game that ultimately decides, depending on how the Jets get on with their newly reinstalled Zach Wilson later on today.
One thing that concerns me with the Bills, and it's been the common theme throughout the course of the season, we spoke about it time and time again, is the reliance on Josh Allen to rush the ball. I mean, in the first half, he only ran the ball, it was 22 yards, and then in the second half, I suppose his numbers are probably flattered by that massive run in the fourth quarter, which I think went for 40-50 yards. But I was looking at the numbers this morning again: Singletary 28 yards, Hines, who had a touchdown, 10 yards rushing, and Cook, the rookie second round pick, brother of Dalvin Cook, 5 yards rushing. I know he caught a touchdown, but that has to be a concern. I mean, you get into playoff time and you play against maybe the Bengals or the Chiefs, and I know they're playing during the regular season and they've beaten the Chiefs, and it'll be interesting to see how they go against the Bengals in a few weeks. But at some stage they need to get that result. You would don't want to look too far ahead into off season, but surely they would be looking to make a big trade, or maybe potentially look at the likes of Josh Jacobs or maybe even Saquon Barkley if he's not retained by the Giants. There'd be two players I would think they would be making a huge push. You look at the off-season last year, they made a huge push for Von Miller. They really felt that was one player that they needed to get, and then putting them over the top. Defensively, they needed a marquee running back to put themselves over the top, because right now, I think ultimately this what could cost them. You get into a game where you can't go up and down the field offensively in terms of Josh Allen with Diggs and with Davis, and you rely on your running game, and right now it's non-existent, and it has to get better. And in fairness, they do try. You look at the numbers after every game. There is a significant amount of handoffs. It's not like they're not trying to maintain balance, but it just this is 2 years on now, and it hasn't been corrected. Look, they're in a great position. I'm not trying to put them down, but to me, it's a huge concern. Would you go with that, or do you think it's just a case of Josh Allen and Josh Allen only?
No, I definitely think it's a concern. I wonder whether they would be willing to invest. I mean, look, Jacobs and Saquon are undoubtedly going to, like, they will probably be the top two and what they will want in terms of a contract. I reckon they will look at it. To me, and the other thing that kind of stood out last night, and I touched on it in what I was saying earlier, was like defending the run. Because one of the things that Von Miller does that's maybe underrated is Von's ability to set the edge. And Von is a really good run defender. He's obviously best known that he gets the money based on his ability to rush the QB. But I think that and that's not, look, the Bills are explosive. And on their day, the Bills could beat anybody. There's a reason I picked them to go to the Super Bowl. But I think my slight concern would be, both in terms of running the ball, but also without Von defending the run. Now, they won't meet teams with the speed that the Dolphins had every week. But at the same time, that is something when you get particularly into the playoffs and you're playing, the top teams, they always look at what they can exploit. And that's where it really comes down to. I think what you'll see them do perhaps is more so maybe go dip again in for a running back in the draft. I just wonder, given how many other pieces they're paying, would they be willing to invest into the running back position? But I suppose that might depend on ultimately how far they go. If they were to, say, get to an AFC Championship game and they lost that on the back of an inability to run the ball, well, that focuses minds, and all of a sudden you might be willing to pay. Whereas if it's a different piece, ultimately, if they come up short because they can't get to the opposing QB, well, that is something that focuses minds. And that's what tends to happen with teams. It's how they lose that gets remembered, and it's that owners and GMs tend to invest in.
Just looking at the Bills' schedule, Bears next week, I would say that's very winnable. Bear in mind the Bears situation. And ultimately, I think the biggest game I would see for them, they go into Cincy to play the Bengals on New Year's Day, and then they finish with the Patriots at home. Are they number one seed bound? Do you think there's another storyline to be written?
Yeah, I think that they're the favorites for it. It feels, it's always like, it's like when you're coming right to the end of a Premier League season and you think, oh my God, you have to win every game, but inevitably other teams stumble as well. So it might be that they end up stumbling in that Bengals game. It might be. Let's see what happens ultimately. But I think others could stumble as well. They'll always. This is the beautiful thing about this league, and you saw it on full display. Last night in that Vikings Colts game, and we'll see it again this evening. There are always surprises. There are always shocks. There are always unexpected results. So to me, yes, the Bills should get the number one seed, but it may come in an unexpected way. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and that's what I was bearing in mind. If they were to get beaten by the Bengals, they could actually drop from the 1 seed to the 3 seed, because the Bengals would then have it, depending if the Bengals run the table and win the remaining games. For the Dolphins, they play the Packers next week. Christmas Day game at home. Interesting to see how the Packers get on against the Rams tomorrow night. They finished with the Jets, and they got the Patriots in between that. It's a difficult loss for them. Bear in mind it's 3 on the. They've lost 3 in a row now, but you would expect them to get back and get themselves in a position to essentially lock down the wild card spot. Before we get into the last game, just a few comments here. Excuse me. I want to show up Alan Brown, top content analysis. Let's keep up the great work. Appreciate it, Alan. That's very kind of you this morning. Luke Kelly has referenced your T-shirt this morning. Column in the comeback from the Vikings last night, and a few other little bits and pieces there around the games and stuff. But I thought the one with the T-shirt was interesting. I thought you'd like to see that one. Owen Healy, Chargers fan, morning lads. Big game for the Chargers tonight against the Titans. Yeah, anything to say about that particular T-shirt? Where did you pick that one out of, Colin?
And that's I do like my T-shirts, and I think this was another one I acquired on one of my adventures stateside. So I'm glad Luke is enjoying that one.
Right, we'll move on to the last one, which was the last game, which was the middle game, the 9:30 game, and we both got this right. We both went for the Browns. Kind of played out in the manner in which we expected, which was a kind of a low-scoring affair. We touched on the show Thursday night when we were doing the preview how inconsistent the Ravens' offense has been recently. Even when Lamar Jackson was playing, we saw them stutter at home to the Panthers, up and down in the game in Jacksonville, in which they lost. Didn't really get any better against the Broncos. And again last week we saw kind of a difficult offensive performance, and it was reflective again last night. Huntley only threw for 138 yards, no touchdowns. A very off night for Justin Tucker. It was a kind of field goal type of game. Whoever had there was opportunities there before half time, misput that one wide, which again was very manageable for him, bearing in mind what we saw over the course of the season. And then even in the pre-game warm-up, they were showing some video clips of ones he was hitting from 55-60, which were going over. And then he had another one blocked in the third quarter, and there were 6 points that at that stage kind of got away from them, and they could have kept them in the game, put them themselves in a position late on. Watson 161 yards, his first touchdown at home as a Brown to People Jones. Chubb didn't really have the most effective game, but yet he finished on 99 yards. I suppose from the Browns' perspective, when they needed to run the ball at a critical point in the game to put the game away, they did. And their defense really stepped up last night with some key players, in particular in the red zone, where they picked off Huntley. I mean, there was a narrative last season from a few people, and even this season, that if Lamar Jackson's contract doesn't get resolved and they were to move on from him, that Huntley is the right man to step in. I think we all saw kind of the reality of the situation last night. He's not at the level of Lamar Jackson. I don't think he ever will be. He's a manageable backup in particular games, but it's like any backup. When you're asked him to consistently play over the course of 4 to 5 weeks and win games, it's not going to happen. It's a difficult one for them, because obviously if the Bengals beat the Bucs tonight, they leapfrog and go in top of the division. They do play each other later on. I think it's week 18 in Cincy, so obviously that'll be the game. Potentially could be the divisional decider, but it's a huge loss. But I wasn't surprised. I've saw enough over this offense over the last 4 to 5 weeks to recognise that against the Browns defence on their day is really good at home, in a game where the fans will be well up for it. They would find a way to stop them and put themselves in a position to win the game, and that's how it played out. So for the Browns, it's a good win. They've beaten every team in their division at home this season, so they look back on games that they've won this year, which have been really good. But for the Ravens, it's a disappointing loss.
Yeah, but as you said, I mean, the Ravens season feels very similar to last year in many ways. They when Lamar isn't there, and you've alluded to Tucker's issues yesterday. I mean, without those two, they just had an inability to score points. And J.K. Dobbins is an interesting one. I think he has learned a lot over the season, but this is a guy who was spitting fire at Ian Rappaport in the off season, and how dare you, and your sources are all wrong, and I'm going to be this and I'm going to be that. And it kind of feels a little bit like, that's where the Ravens had this attitude, right? With Marcus Peters and the dancing and all of that stuff, and it was like, win some games first, lads. They go out and get the ring. You're coming from a storied franchise. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that can be said about Ray Lewis, but when Ray Lewis was on the field, Ray Lewis was on the field, and that's I think that. I wonder where the Ravens go from here, right? Because what happens with the contract? I think even with Lamar, there are there's huge unrest about the OC. When I was on with the UK Ravens podcast a few weeks ago, I mean, they were talking about him, the way in which both Broncos and Giants fans talk about Pat Shurmur, and that'll tell you how highly they think of him or not. So I just wonder where exactly they go from here. I think John Harbaugh they have some phenomenal players, and they have incredible talent on defense, I think, right across the roster. But I think on offense, they're so reliant on Lamar and Lamar's ability to make magic happen that when Lamar isn't there, they really, really struggle. And it just could be, a case where ultimately they're left to come up short again, and that we kind of look back on this Ravens kind of maybe even 5-year period and say 1 or 2 extra pieces. And this could have been a team that had a ring, 2 rings, but it certainly feels like right now they're going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, you touched on J.K. Dobbins. In fairness to J.K. Dobbins last night, he had a really good game. He's come back off it. It could have been in a season-ending injury. He had an operation. He came back. You could see it last week. He was slowly getting back to full fitness last week, and he could have put the team on their back last week and ran them to victory in that late drive against the Steelers. And last night he went for over 100 yards, and they couldn't stop him throughout the course of the game. But unfortunately, when he got into the red zone, difficult decisions, probably bad play calling potentially, and they're throwing it instead of relying on the run to get punching into the end zone. That was a disappointing factor. They're lacking in wide receivers, Colin, and we've seen it. Like they have made attempts over the past few years in terms of in the draft with Bateman and stuff, but he hasn't stayed fit. I mean, we've had 2 years of him now, and we've hardly seen him on the field. And other players have just the Hollywood Brown trade and still kind of like I never thought he was a marquee wide receiver, but he was very effective in that offense for the Ravens. So that was a surprise at the time. Last April in the draft that they traded him away to Arizona, and like despite the frailties and difficulties of Cardinals this year, he has had a reasonably good season. And even within that, he's been out for a period of time. So they might reflect on that and say that was one. If they look back, that they would consider it's maybe the wrong move at the time. And then you've got the defensive coordinator, Mike McDonald, and you're talking about the offensive coordinator being under scrutiny from the fans. I have Ravens fans that are continuously challenging him as well. Like Wink Martindale was let go at the end of last season. They felt it was just time to move on from him, and he's had a reasonably good season as a defensive coordinator with the Giants. And there's still Ravens fans that feel that he was on the wrong end of he was the fall guy essentially for what happened in the second half of last season when they had so many injuries on defense they couldn't stop both the rushing and passing attacks, but he was playing with very little and he was exposed because of the players in which he was dealing with. So there's questions there. Harbaugh's got a lot to deal with. Obviously he's never going to be let go because he's such a great head coach, and the stability in the NFL is so crucial. We see that with the Steelers and Mike Tomlin and how they play under him, but there's a lot of questions to come, and obviously the big one being the Lamar Jackson contract. But look, it's not over yet for the Ravens. They've still got winnable games. They'll still be in the playoffs even as a wild card, but big loss for them. Be interested to see how they go on from this next week. When we recorded on Thursday, the Lions-Jets game, we were discussing on the basis that Mike White was going to be the quarterback, as you alluded to earlier on. Obviously, Mike White was ruled out on Friday, and Zach Wilson, who was activated back onto the panel during the week, but again we assumed it was going to be as backup, will start tonight. And even from a betting perspective, Colin, the line has jumped back and forth because the bookies don't know who should be favoured for this game. Do you see Zach Wilson comeback game tonight? He's been, I suppose in a way the expectation is lowered on him despite being the second pick in the draft last year. Now that he's had a difficult few weeks, his attitude was wrong in the game against the Patriots, in which they lost, and obviously he was removed from the team and Mike White played. Do you see a scenario where he could come out tonight and kind of prove the doubters wrong, put the Jets in a position to win this game?
I am interested to see, and that's kind of what in terms of J.K. Dobbins. My point was, I suppose, about a little bit of a humbling. And yeah, he has been like the way he's bounced back has been really impressive. Now we got to see can Zach Wilson, he was I suppose he hopefully has learned a lesson in humility. Because the response, I can only imagine the way in which that Jets defense must have reacted for him to be dropped, not just, to QB2, but to QB3. So definitely humbling experience. How it does, I think, will be an interesting one. I had picked the Lions even with Mike White. Now, partly that was just on the basis of how beaten up Mike White was. I mean, he was, he was like one of those, in like basically a table or chair after a WrestleMania cage match. So I'm not surprised to see that the Jets doctors refused to sign off on that because they didn't want to deal with that. It's a big opportunity for Zach Wilson, but we will see how it goes. I mean, he has really only shown a couple of flashes. I don't feel like Trevor Lawrence, right up until the past few weeks in particular, now I think we've seen him take a big step forward. But Wilson didn't have the lack of a rookie season that Trevor Lawrence did. He didn't have all that nonsense with the head coach. But Trevor Lawrence still had quarters here and there, or he had moments here and there, like half a game. But Zach Wilson has had throws. Yes, he has had some throws, but you can't say at any point that he has really put it together for a full game or maybe even a half. The fact that his teammates were wearing Mike White jerseys tells a story. So I think for Zach Wilson, he needs to forget about the fans. He needs to forget about the media narrative. What he needs to do is win his teammates back. And certainly going up against a Lions defense that can be porous, it offers an opportunity. I'm still on the Lions. I think that they should be able to get it done. But yeah, for Zach Wilson, this is what the NFL, it gives you redemption opportunities. It is entirely up to you whether you take them or not.
Yeah, the redemption opportunity probably is coming along a lot quicker than most Jets and him himself would have thought. I picked the Jets more so because I was impressed how impressed I've been with their defense throughout the course of the season, and when in adverse weather conditions, which we're expected to see, I think they might be in a position to slow down this Lions offense to put the Jets in a position to win the game. If Zach Wilson can just do a game management and allow other players on the team to remain, and particularly then obviously on the defensive side of the ball. A couple of interesting ones. We spoke on Thursday around the Panthers Steelers game. It was kind of inevitable that Kenny Pickett would be ruled out, bearing in mind it was his second concussion of the season. There was a lot of conversations from Steelers fans which I spoke to, and the narrative all week was that Mason Rudolph would leapfrog Mitchell Trubisky and start the game tonight. That isn't the case. Mitchell Trubisky has been confirmed. In a game in which the Panthers, we spoke about this great run the Panthers are on, and great storyline coming towards the back end of the season, that they've essentially traded away so much value, and then obviously the team have rallied around the interim head coach. When in addition to potentially leapfrog the Bucs in the top of the division tonight, it makes me even more confident on a Panthers victory with Mitch Trubisky at quarterback, bearing in mind what we saw last week. And as you rightly called out during the show on Monday, he's come into 2 games this season, thrown 3 picks in each game. Were you surprised that he remains a starter?
Well, it was the fact, I suppose, that Kenny Pickett came in relief of him and threw 3 picks in the and then he came in and threw 3 picks in relief of Kenny Pickett. It's I am in some ways, but not in others. I just think that I don't think either Mason Rudolph or Mitch Trubisky are the answer there. So I don't think it really matters, and I think ultimately he's probably gone with the experience, with the guy who has been a franchise guy in Chicago, albeit it didn't work out. For Mitch Trubisky, I mean, we heard that he was kind of unimpressed ultimately when he was benched, but then he gets the opportunity and he just hasn't taken it. And I think he will probably look at this as a lost season. I think they only signed him to a 2-year deal, and from what I remember of the contract, it was pretty much it wasn't big money, and it was front loaded as well. So he might find himself looking for a new team ultimately come the off season. But I think that's ultimately the experience was what got him the start over Mason Rudolph. I mean, would I wouldn't have confidence in either of those guys. I would be more confident if Kenny Pickett was starting if I was the Steelers, because at least the potential I think is still there. But I'm glad to see that Kenny Pickett won't be in there this week. We had talked about that on the preview show as well, how teams signing off on QBs to come in 1 week after a concussion, especially a second concussion, just seemed absolutely insane. So glad to see that hasn't happened.
And finally, we just have a quick point on the Bengals-Bucks game. It was obviously last night's result. We're kind of referencing the Panthers there. If the Panthers are to beat the Steelers, they'll be keen to see how the Bucks get on in the 9:25 game against the Bengals at home to continue with the divisional lead. And obviously, if the Bengals win, they'll take over the ownership of the lead in the AFC North. Big game for both sides. I think we both picked the Bengals. I haven't changed my thoughts on the game, but it will be interesting to see how both teams react to the results, bearing in mind the Ravens have lost, and they'll know come 9:25 from a Bucks perspective whether the Panthers have won and essentially could be top of the division should they lose to the Bengals.
Yeah, I think the other thing, Brian, that we actually haven't talked about, because it isn't just the last night's games that we haven't that we're discussing. We should probably look a little bit at the 49ers. In fact, that the 49ers with Brock Purdy there, they just looked like they didn't miss a beat, and they were without Debo. And yet they just go out and they dominate. And that was another game where we saw another ridiculous roughing the passer call. I mean, ultimately, what is Nick Bosa supposed to do? But Kyle Shanahan has the 49ers in some ways are what the Colts, I think, wanted to be. Like the Colts wanted to be in a kind of a post-Peyton Manning, post-Andrew Luck world. They wanted to maybe create a system where it wasn't QB dependent and it didn't really matter who you slotted in. You just got on with it. But ultimately, it all fell apart for them. Whereas for the 49ers, it just doesn't seem to matter who is in there. They find ways to win. And they have clinched the division. So now the question, I suppose, is how deep can Brock Purdy go in the playoffs? And then what might that mean for the offseason and the QB conversations in the Bay Area?
Yeah, which is why I was really focusing on the 49ers last night during the Vikings game, because how significant it would be for them to get the second seed. They would essentially have 2 games at home potentially before going to Philly. Should Philly maintain their form and be hosting the championship game. Big decisions coming in this off season. It's a massive one. You're now essentially dealing with 3 quarterbacks. There were 2 within the organisation, and how you manage the relationships and what you want to do with them going forward. We'll just touch on our 2 teams very briefly. Obviously, the Giants play Sunday night. As you touched on there, the 49ers beating the Seahawks was significant for the Giants. It gives the Giants a little bit more breathing room. Essentially, whoever loses this game tonight on Sunday Night Football remains in playoff position. But at some stage, you need to start winning games. It's going to be a typical NFC East game. We discussed it on Thursday. Obviously, I've gone Giants, you've gone Commanders. And I just want to touch on Russell Wilson, Colin. I know it's not a game that has any bearing on the playoffs. It's probably the game this weekend for both teams at very little significance. Maybe drafts, well, obviously, you are picking this year, unfortunately, because of the trade. But Russell Wilson was cleared of the concussion protocol. We actually spoke a bit about that Thursday around how players now are getting cleared, and they kind of early on in the season focus seemed to have kind of moved off again. But he was cleared out of the protocol, but yet the Broncos have made a decision not to play him tonight. Were you taken back and surprised by that decision, or do you think it's, bearing in mind how the season is going, there's no point in risking him?
I think I'm happy about it because, as I said, I mean, Russ came off with a golf ball size lump on his head last week. We all saw the image of him on the turf. He was clearly knocked out, and I don't care what reports come out during the week, and I don't care about how great he looked and he passed the protocols. That to me would have been silly. Do I think the decision would have been different if the Broncos were chasing a playoff spot? Yeah, it probably would be, and that probably speaks to the NFL, the protocols. I just think that I am happy to see him sit, and the Broncos don't even. This is the thing. The Broncos, it's not like they get any advantage even though by losing, because ultimately the pick has been traded away. So it will be the Colt McCoy versus Brett Rippon matchup. But it is the right decision for me, even if Russ himself apparently is none too happy with it.
Just a few comments before we wrap up, Colin. It's gas. We're talking very interesting. We're talking about all the different playoff permutations, and Owen has alluded to it very well here. Owen's a Chargers fan. He said obviously the big game for him is the Titans Chargers. With a passing interest in the Pats Raiders, bearing in mind the Raiders are sitting in 7th seed, and the Lions Jets obviously, because the Jets are 7 and 6 as well. Dolphins loss obviously was a big help for them while chasing the wild card spots. And just a piece around the Chargers having Mike Williams back. We spoke about it. I know you've been up and down on his, whether he's a number one wide receiver, but it is significant to see him back in the team. So again, that's interesting. And then Alan Brown obviously is referring to the game which he's looking forward to the most. Bengals Bucks again. It's a really enticing game on Sky 9:25 this evening. That's about it for the time being. Colin, we will be back tomorrow evening as always to reflect on another crazy Sunday. This show again as always brought to you by Cassidy Travel. Great to have a Sunday morning show. Great to have some Saturday games, and we were fortunate to have two really good ones. Maybe not so much the middle one, but if only the NFL could put on some Saturday games throughout the course of the season, but never to happen with all the college football. A blank slate last night gives them a good opportunity. And obviously next weekend, Christmas Eve, on a Saturday, the NFL have moved the games from Christmas Day to Saturday. There's 3 games on Christmas Day as well, but again, another big slate on Christmas Eve. A nightmare scenario for the people who will be on Santa duty on Christmas Eve, but we'll get through it somehow. Any final thoughts, Colin?
Just look forward to. I mean, look, it was another record breaker last night in terms of a team coming back from a deficit. Those records will continue to be broken, and every week offers us something. And I would think I look forward to discussing all of the action on tomorrow night's show.
Yeah, same here. Okay, for now, we'll be back tomorrow night, 9 o'clock. Enjoy your Sunday, enjoy the games, and chat tomorrow.
Thanks for the interaction, everyone.